Coming up on Choppers Politics.
We cannot tie our hands to EU laws and just accept their laws as if we're a sort of satellite like the dead moon going around the live Earth.
I'm Christopher Hope, the Telegraph's chief political correspondent. Chopper to my friends, and this is Choppers Politics. Now cast your mind back to a year ago. We just had a general election, we were coming to the end of a busy year of Brexit, and we even had different theme music. Well, what a year it's been. Quite extraordinary. The year unlike I've ever experienced ever in my time covering politics for Telegraph. It's been so difficult to cover it. Never going forward, always going back, then forward a bit, never quite clear where it ends. Little did I know. The never-ending story that is the Brexit trade talks could go on and on. One step forward, two steps back, and repeat. Now, I was supposed to be talking to you today to reflect on a trade deal we may or may not have agreed on Sunday. Then the music changed, with the PM saying no deal was now a strong possibility. But the weekend came and went, and the Prime Minister and Ursula von der Leyen, the President of the European Commission, agreed to ditch the arbitrary deadline they had talked about and keep talking. Possibly a sign that maybe a deal isn't quite off the table just yet, but at this point, who knows? And just as importantly, should we even be worried about not securing a trade deal by the end of this month? Later in the podcast, I'll be discussing just that with former Tory MEP and trade expert David Campbell-Bannerman. Plus the Telegraph's very own Charles Moore, the authorised biographer of Margaret Thatcher, will be here to discuss what the late PM would have made about Brexit and where we stand now, and how she's depicted in Netflix's The Crown. But first, a long time ago, at a negotiation summit far, far away, it was Theresa May who was in the middle of fraught talks with the dark side, with the EU. Doesn't that feel like a lifetime ago? And someone who knows more about that time than most is the former PM's Brexit advisor, Raoul Ruparel. We dialed him up to talk about the landing zones in the Brexit talks, the difference between Boris Johnson and his old boss, and how those talks are really going. Raoul, welcome back to the podcast.
Thanks for having me.
Where are we at the moment? Summarise, if you can, in layman's terms, what are the sticking points?
Well, I'll do my best. So I think there has been a bit of progress in the last few days. I think there are two big sticking points remaining, two or three maybe. The main one is on what's known as a level playing field. So these are the terms under which the UK can sell into the EU's market and focus specifically around issues such as workers' rights and environmental law. And the discussion is around, as I understand it, the two sides have agreed not to regress or lower from their current standards in these areas. But the question is how that evolves over time. And I think what the EU wanted originally was to say if the UK didn't follow any increase in EU standards in these areas, they would face tariffs, unilateral tariffs from the EU. I think where we are now is that two sides have agreed that if there is a divergence here, by one side or the other raising their standards, there will be an arbitration panel that looks at this issue, considers whether there's any unfair advantage from either side from this gap, and if there is, allows for some measures to be taken in terms of tariffs or ways to enhance the fairness. And I think that's a more balanced approach. So things seems to be moving in a slightly more positive direction in that area.
So it sounds like you're saying we're moving away from the ratchet of being tied into future EU laws.
Yeah, I think it's moving away from that sort of ratchet. I mean, there will still be this issue that any divergence has to be managed over time in this area. But I think it's much more about an arbitration panel considering the impact of that divergence rather than the EU raising standards and unilaterally imposing tariffs on the UK. So it's a more balanced approach, I think.
Okay, and on fishing, you see a solution there with annual negotiations, maybe compensation for the French fishermen?
Look, it's always hard to know where things are on the fishing side. It looks as if they are still talking about, firstly, grandfathering some of the rights and quotas for EU fishermen, so it's not a cliff edge.
And that means what, grandfathering?
So winding down over time, the access and quotas that EU fishermen have now, and maybe even maintaining the status quo for a few years to allow them to adjust and allow UK fishing fleets to build up in sort of anticipation anticipation of taking advantage of the new rights. But there's still a long way to go in terms of what happens after that, and the proportion of certain fish and fish stocks that can be caught in UK waters and things like that. So I think the gaps are still pretty large on fishing.
There's also an issue, is there not, with English quotas? I think they've been sold forever to some foreign fishermen. Is that right?
Yeah, so I mean, often, you get foreign-owned firms buying up English quota or foreign boats, and so it's it is tricky to find out the exact rules. I think there is an issue now coming up around where certain fish caught in UK waters can or should be landed in terms of brought to shore. So there's lots of tricky detail in here, and this has been a long running gripe for the UK fishing industry in many ways. So there's lots of historical challenges here as well.
Do you see a landing zone? We're in the final mile. How far through the final mile do you think we are? We're speaking, obviously, on Tuesday morning this week when things can change very quickly.
Yeah, so I think we're getting there. It does sound more positive, as I said, on the level playing fields. I've never thought fish would scupper a deal. I think they will find something to do on fish if that's the last remaining issue. There are a couple of small bits and pieces on the overall governance of the deal as well, which need to be finalised. But, I think we're pretty close. If you want to put it in percentage terms, it's the last couple of percent to try and get over the line of the deal. So, we're almost there.
Are you surprised it's so near the deadline?
Firstly, we're trying to do a lot in a very short amount of time, so it's not surprising that this has run long. When you think back to how long it takes to negotiate FTAs and how much has been done in the course of 1 year. That being said, the issues have been the same for quite a long time in terms of these big political sticking points. So it is a bit frustrating that it's taken this long to really get the two sides to engage in meaningful sort of movements and concessions. I think the main thing is, from a business perspective, just a lack of clarity at this late stage is causing real anxiety and real challenges. While a lot of the changes are going to be the same, whether there's a deal or not, there are still things that businesses need to know, and they just don't have time to prepare for the end of the year now. And that also reduces the value of the deal because they can't take advantage of it.
Would you call this Brexit a hard Brexit, a soft Brexit, somewhere in between?
I've never really liked those terms because, they mean different things to everyone.
But that's the problem, Raoul.
Yeah. Look, there could be a harder Brexit in terms of there not being a deal at all. There could be a softer Brexit in terms of being more tied into the EU. So, it's somewhere in between, I guess. But ultimately, it depends on what sort of relationship you envisage. I think the one thing I would say is it is going to be quite a shallow deal. The main thing it will do is zero tariff, zero quotas, which is good for certain sectors, in particular agri-food and automotive, for example. But in a lot of other areas, the challenges or changes that business might face and the things they have to adjust to are going to happen regardless. So in that sense, it is some way from the sort of comprehensive FTA that was talked about at the start of this year, and obviously a long way from the sort of deep and special partnership we heard from the previous government.
Well, in terms of the previous government, is this a deal you think Theresa May could have got? I know you were helping advise on her talks. Could she have got this deal?
A couple of points I would make. Obviously, a lot hinged around Northern Ireland, and obviously Boris Johnson was willing to agree to an approach in Northern Ireland that I don't think Theresa May would have agreed to, or certainly wasn't willing, because the ideas were around at the same time when she was in government. And so by agreeing to that approach in Northern Ireland and sort of separating that out and having a solution for Northern Ireland that works regardless of the future relationship, it allowed for this kind of more shallow FTA style approach for the rest of the United Kingdom. And so, in that sense, if you didn't have that Northern Ireland piece, you wouldn't have been able to get this kind of agreement. And so that is the big difference. And obviously there is the additional difference that Boris Johnson was able to win a large majority and therefore able to push through his vision of Brexit, both on Northern Ireland and on this kind of FTA. So in that sense, those are the main differences. I don't think per se Theresa May would have opposed this type of approach if she could have achieved it. I think the challenge was she just couldn't fit it with what she wanted in terms of the outcome on Northern Ireland.
And what was the problem that she viewed Brexit as a problem and Boris Johnson saw it as an opportunity? I
don't think that was really the problem. In my experience, Theresa was always very keen to try and see the positives from Brexit, and actually she was very aware of the type of approach she needed to pursue and that the party wanted to pursue. But I think the challenge was she was very, I think very sensitive to the challenges in Northern Ireland, the security situation, and also she was relying on the DUP for her majority.
Yes.
So as we saw, Boris Johnson, obviously he tried to push through his version of Brexit in the previous parliament and failed. So the turning point was really his ability to win an election. So I think that more is the biggest difference between him and Theresa, rather than any particular difference on their view of Brexit or their type of negotiation, to be honest.
Raoul Ruparel, have you kept a diary?
In parts, but not a comprehensive one.
It could be important for historians when they decide to chart Brexit. We're nearly there, aren't we?
Yeah, we're getting there. I mean, look, I think we also have to remember this is going to evolve over time. Not everything is going to be done on day one next year. The UK is phasing some of the implementation on its side, so there is going to be a tail of things, and we will still be discussing this, next year and in the future, but in different terms. It's not going to be in the same way we are now. But yeah, there are still a few more bits to come, I think, in the sort of Brexit chapter, as it were.
When do you think Brexit will be done?
I think once we get to the end of next year, and into that, then we will have seen most of the phasing in done. We will have seen the new relationship bedded in. We'll have seen the two sides set out their longer term approaches to things without sort of the UK as a member of the EU. I think that's when it will really start to feel, going then and beyond, that we really are fully on a completely different setting and a completely different relationship. I think next year will still be lots of things in flux because of things being implemented, businesses getting used to it, the borders getting ready, all that kind of stuff. That will all continue to flux. So I think after the end of next year, it will start to settle in more into sort of the normal new relationship, as it were.
12 more months of Brexit, with or without a deal. You heard it here first. It'll keep us busy. Raoul Ruparel, thank you for joining me this week on Choppers Politics. It's been great. Thank you.
Cheers.
Now, as we edge closer to December the 31st, the deadline when the UK will exit the Brexit transition period, currently there's nothing set in stone. Should the government's New Year's resolution be to stop worrying about it? Just leave on WTO terms and negotiate from that position? Well, I'm joined now by former Tory MEP and trade expert David Campbell-Bannerman, who thinks, well, something just like that. David Campbell-Bannerman, welcome to Choppers Politics. Now, when we last met you in the pub, in the Red Lion pub, you were just quitting as an MEP.
Yes.
You turned up in the pub with your office stuff in carrier bags.
Yeah.
I've never seen a more physical embodiment of Brexit in my entire life.
Well, thanks, Christopher. Yeah, I was heading from Brussels up to Norwich, actually, including taking my ship. That's a model ship that was in my office in Brussels. And I did actually get here in one piece, which was quite remarkable given everything. But there you go.
And that ship almost sort of leads us on to what you're here to talk about, which is Brexit and trade.
Yes.
Do you worry about a no trade deal Brexit on WTO terms in about just over 2.5 weeks' time?
I don't. I would prefer a deal, or I have preferred a deal. But, looking at the terms the EU's offered us, it looks like they're offering us a very thin free trade agreement, which is not what I had in mind.
What's that mean, David Campbell-Bannerman? What does a thin trade deal mean?
It just means it's not very wide. I mean, the EU wants to get rid of tariffs because it has a massive surplus, a goods surplus with us. And it would be paying £13 billion in tariffs, and we'd only be paying £5 billion in tariffs if there was a no-deal situation, which shows you how big the trade imbalance is. So the goods side suits them, having no tariffs on their goods. But of course, we're more interested in the services side. And there is no services in this free trade agreement being offered. I would say, if you go to no deal, it doesn't mean you stop negotiating. But the key difference is if you're in a no deal situation and the EU's paying 13 billion in tariffs and it's hurting German manufacturers and French producers, farmers, or whatever, then I think you're going to get a better deal at the end of the day, a proper trade deal, which is what we should have been offered. We were offered it 3 times by Mr. Tusk, President Tusk, and Mr. Barnier himself, and they've gone back on that.
So it's been forgotten, has it, then, that because we rely so heavily on services being the major part of our economy compared to manufacturing, that in fact, because that's outside of the actual trade deal they're negotiating at the moment, we shouldn't worry so much about it?
No, because I don't think we'll stop negotiating. In fact, I was looking at an Irish story this morning that, the Irish government is saying that that's what will happen. They will carry on negotiating. But the key difference is, this is what people don't understand. The EU Council that just met last week, Thursday, Friday, they set the guidelines that Mr. Barnier and even the von der Leyen, the head of the Commission, have to follow. They're not exactly puppets, I'm not saying that, but they have to comply with the guidance set. And that guidance would have to change from political punishment as now to trade, a proper trade guidance. Let's get the best trade deal possible.
So does the problem here go back to when those guidelines were set?
Yes, it does. And actually, looking back at my notes, it was about February, just after we left the EU, that suddenly Mr. Barnier announced that they wouldn't be giving us a Canada-style option. Well, as part of the withdrawal agreement, they were going to offer us a free trade agreement. It was always regarded as being a Canada-style deal. I mean, I've called it Super Canada, as you know, I keep mentioning it.
What's that mean, David, quickly?
Bigger, better and wider than the Canada deal with the EU. I mean, Canada is like 98% of tariffs that got rid of. We'd want 100%, for example.
So examples being of what? What would be in a Super Canada deal that wouldn't be in a Canada deal?
A lot more in services, a lot more in financial services. I mean, Canada's got quite a big financial service sector, but we would have more of that. And because it also reflects we are closer historically and, we've been integrated for 40, 45 years.
In layman's terms then, you're saying services. Is that lawyers, financiers that you wouldn't pay an extra tariff on their services? Is that what you mean?
Well, you don't have tariffs on services. You have restrictions.
Right.
You have licensing. So like we've heard about the passport, the EU passport you need to actually trade in financial services within the single market. And that's why British companies have had to set up subsidiaries. If they don't have them, a lot of the big banks have them anyway, in order to trade. So that's a license. It's a non-tariff, as it's called.
So it allows you to have these offices working across borders. But going back to February then, there was a decision was there in February that we weren't going to get the Canada-style deal, and that led almost inexorably to this paralysis at the moment.
Yes, it goes back to the EU's unreasonable approach. And I don't just say that, I wanted a deal. I want to part on good terms. I think it's neater, tidier. Yeah. But having said that, what they've tried to do, looking at it, is basically it's half the way to an EEA, a kind of Norway-style deal, which we said we didn't want. And the key reason we didn't want to be like Norway has to accept all single market legislation from the EU without any voice, any say on it. It just goes along with it. It made one row about the postal directive, but then had to back off. We don't want to be in that situation. We want an arm's length relationship, which is what a free trade agreement like Canada is about. Basically, the EU is asking things of us as a sovereign independent nation it hasn't done with Canada or Japan or even Australia, which is the new deal coming through. And that is unacceptable, and that has caused the problem.
So there's this almost punitive element as part of these talks, which is what's caused the problems then?
Yes, it is. I mean, that is the most dramatic factor, is that, if we diverge from their new laws, let alone the old laws, there's a thing called non-regression clause, which means you don't actually get rid of the legislation you have already, environment, for example. But I mean, it's ridiculous. That is like Norway, where any new law that EU comes up with, Norway has to accept it. We wanted a loose relationship, and they're trying to tie us in because they fear us being, as Katja Adler said, super competitive. And that's what really lies behind this. They're trying to tie us, put us in a straitjacket in regulatory terms.
We haven't even talked about fish yet, have we, David Campbell-Bannerman?
We should talk about fish.
We should talk about fish. Fish, I heard you say previously that fish is actually a UN issue, not a trade issue. Is that right?
Yes. I mean, when you talk about fishing waters, that's United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, UNCLOS. And that comes up with things like territorial waters being 12 miles from your coastline. And you have these exclusive economic zones, EEZs, which go right out 200 miles. I mean, if you look at the map around the Scottish Islands, around Scotland, around Cornwall, these 200-mile-an-hour zones are massive. And it has meant we have effectively about 60 to 70% of Europe's fish, but we only have a quota of about 12%. And that is the problem. That's why there's such a hard landing on French fishermen and Spanish fishermen and Dutch fishermen, which could all be managed by a fishing agreement. Norway does this, Iceland does it very successfully, the Falkland Islands does it very successfully, but no, the EU doesn't want a fishing agreement. It wants to seize our waters, which is a sovereign matter. I mean, when it comes to the fish you catch, that is a trade matter. So, the waters are one thing, that the fish you catch is different. And yes, 80% of what we currently catch, I mean, what people forget, of course, is that that's going to change massively. We're able to land more cod and haddock, which is what the British consumer wants. Then those figures are going to change dramatically. So all this nonsense of, all of your fish goes to Europe. That will change.
So, David, are you saying here that in these talks they've confused two things, the fish that we have to land and where they're landed, with the sovereignty of those waters? And it's that confusion which is the problem at the heart of the talks?
Yes, along with, I think, the level playing field, as they call it, I would call it sort of a regulatory straitjacket. That's the core issue, because, that will really hamper our economy and cost us billions in years to come. But fishing is very totemic and very important, particularly Scotland, Peterhead, Fraserburgh, those are big fishing areas. And we need to be fair to them. Ted Heath, Edward Heath abandoned them in 1973 as a price worth paying. We've got to look after them. We can rebuild the fishing industry. It could be worth billions more than it is at the moment.
In terms of what you've heard so far on the issue of the ratchet, on the issue of fishing, I mean, how can you see these two things being aligned? The problem is when you get sovereignty running up against trade agreements, the two are not, they're like apples and pears, aren't they? And that's the problem at the heart of the talks.
Trade agreements are always difficult. I mean, I worked on Canada, I worked on Colombia, Peru, and Japan, and New Zealand.
Is that for the EU rather than the UK?
For the EU and India as well, actually, which has, of course, been announced today, which is I'm very pleased about. I was born in India, Mumbai. That's great, and that's going to be a big deal. But these things are not easy. I mean, the EU-India free trade agreement has taken 12 years and gone nowhere. And relations break down, like the US-EU TTIP deal has broken down, it's going nowhere. So these are difficult, and it does involve a bit of a trade in sovereignty. But I mean, you've got to be in control, of your own area anyway. I mean, what EU is actually sort of trespassing on, in my view, is areas that are not normally contained within free trade agreements.
So David Campbell-Bannerman, just winding up, given what you've heard about coming out of these talks, about this ratchet and about the offer on fish as it may be, is any of this to you what Brexit should look like?
No, I think most of the deal is probably fine from what I've heard of it, in security and all of that. But no, we cannot tie our hands to EU laws and just accept their laws as if we're a sort of satellite, like the dead moon going around the live earth. That's not acceptable. And the fishing waters is a sovereign matter. If there was no deal, we'd have 100% control of those waters under international UN laws. So no, it isn't. This is why there's a battle. I commend the Prime Minister for holding firm, and David Frost and Oliver Lewis. They've done a fantastic job. And if it fails, it will be because of the EU's unreasonable demands. But I think we'll be negotiating pretty soon thereafter.
David Campbell-Bannerman, former Tory MEP and now a trade expert. Thank you so much for joining us this week on Choppers Politics. Thank you.
Thanks, Robert.
Now stay with us. Next, we'll be chatting with Margaret Thatcher's authorised biographer Charles Moore about whether he thinks Gillian Anderson has captured the former PM well in the Netflix series The Crown. Right after this.
It begins as a love story. Couples who meet as young activists, bonded in a fight against injustice.
We seem to have similar outlooks in life. He often made me feel very special.
It felt like we were in love. I remember it being quite magical.
As far as I was concerned, we had a future together.
I fully did envisage my future with him.
But then, he starts acting strangely.
Suddenly there were secrets and there were inconsistencies and there were things that didn't make sense.
Then one day, he leaves.
I came home from work and I realised immediately that he'd gone.
Vanishes without a trace. And the reason why these men disappear is so disturbing, it's led to a formal apology from the state.
I never for a moment thought that it would be what it actually turned out to be.
This is Bed of Lies, the true story of one of the biggest scandals in recent British history, and the latest podcast from the Telegraph.
Talk about the Stasi in East Germany. That's not how we understand our society.
A tale that travels from the safety of a loving bedroom to the very heart of the law. Search for Bed of Lies wherever you're listening to this.
And we're back. Now, with much of the country's social activities limited to binging on box sets, and Londoners, of course, joining their fellow countrymen this week in tougher restrictions, a lot of you may have got stuck into the Netflix series The Crown. This show, of course, focuses on the royal family, and the latest series features a politician at the heart of that difficult relationship between the UK and the EU, going back decades, Margaret Thatcher.
Your Majesty, I think we have enough respect for one another personally to ask ourselves some of the bigger questions, woman to woman. We are the same age after all.
Really?
Just 6 months between us.
Oh? And who is the senior?
I am, ma'am.
Charles Moore is Margaret Thatcher's authorised biographer and, of course, a columnist for The Telegraph and a former editor of the Daily and Sunday Telegraphs. Charles, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you, Chris.
You've been watching The Crown on Netflix. What's your view on the Margaret Thatcher as imagined by Gillian Anderson?
I think it's very good on one thing and not very good on the rest. The one thing is that Gillian Anderson captures the incredible determination and seriousness of Margaret Thatcher. The woman coming from nowhere, as it were, not in a privileged background, and entering this world of power, and how difficult that was for her and how determined she was working her way through it. That's well done, I think. What it doesn't have is any of the sort of interesting humanity of Margaret Thatcher, which was a very big thing with those who worked with her, for example. And it doesn't explain that her passion was to do with a sort of direct communication with a lot of people in Britain who felt excluded by what had gone on in the 1970s, like ordinary trade union members, for example, who were being pushed around by trade union leaders. And its political account, I'm afraid, of the era is just rubbish. I mean, it's just the usual, the absurd scene when Michael Fagan, the sort of vagrant, gets into the Queen's bedroom, which was absolutely true story that he did, and quite extraordinary thing. But absurd scene because he then gives a sort of speech, which is rather like a speech by the Labour leader Neil Kinnock at that time, which sort of goes on and on and on about how awful Mrs. Thatcher is. And the poor Queen sort of tucked up in bed thinking, how am I going to get rid of this wretched man? And he's presented as a sort of heroic seer who understands the reality of Thatcher's Britain. And the Queen actually says afterwards, when somebody says he's mad, that man, she says, but in a good way, like Lear's fool. And, that's so unlike the Queen. I mean, the Queen notoriously doesn't like Shakespeare and she doesn't like fools of any sort. So, all that's unreal, I think.
And the snobbery she encountered in Balmoral, is that right? Would she have gone on stalking in a bright blue dress, for example?
She certainly would not have gone stalking in a bright blue dress, no. It's factually wrong, all of that, about the idea, for example, that the Queen would be rude to Mrs. Thatcher, which she is in that section, is not believable. It's also not believable that Mrs. Thatcher would be rude to the Queen, which is also shown from time to time. However, I think the Balmoral film does capture one aspect, which is here are Dennis and Margaret entering a world they don't know. It's a very different world, and they're ill at ease, and some of the courtiers and things are laughing at them, and I think there was some of that.
The unwritten rules, they have to guess
somehow,
what the rules are.
In a funny way, actually, odd thing to say, but the Thatchers are too formal. Because, if you're at ease in a grand circumstances, you're more informal. And that's the sort of atmosphere at Balmoral, I would think. I'm no expert. And then the Thatchers are very sort of buttoned up because she's on her best behaviour. That, I think, is well conveyed, though it's grossly exaggerated.
And that low bow, is that real, do you think?
Yes, she did a low curtsy, always very low curtsy. Yeah.
It looks ridiculous on the programme.
Yeah, she did. It did look a bit ridiculous in real life, actually.
And the Queen, of course, tried to forecast Thatcher's first cabinet, and then when she reshuffled it to give more people of her image, maybe more people who weren't wet, to use the term of the time. Is that right? You think the Queen has that?
No, I don't think that's right. I think it has to be understood that the Queen really, really is truly unpolitical. Of course, she's very interested in what's going on, but the idea she's trying to push a particular view is quite wrong. That one thing she is trying to do politically is to make sure there's as much peace and unity. And therefore, she was sometimes worried by big conflicts during Mrs. Thatcher's time, such as the miners' strike. But that doesn't mean she's against Mrs. Thatcher's policy. It's just that she has a different purpose as head of state
to unite
to the purpose of what a head of government would have.
What do you think of the impression by Gillian Anderson of Margaret Thatcher? It struck me a bit late Thatcher when it was meant to be a younger Thatcher.
I think that's an acute point. There's no development. So, this is 11 and a half years we're seeing of Mrs. Thatcher in office. She changed a great deal in that time.
And the voice changed, didn't it?
Yeah, and the appearance, everything. And except the fundamental approach to life. And Mrs. Thatcher, who came in, was nervous and uneasy and so on, and, if you like, innocent. And the Mrs. Thatcher who came out was very experienced, much grander, because she'd become a really world-famous figure.
We Are a Grandmother, famously.
Yes, and
the royal weave.
Yes, and I think that development would have been interesting to portray. Of course, this is not a film about Mrs. Thatcher; it's a film about the Queen and the monarchy. But I would think that would have been more interesting to portray than this static figure.
Do you think there should be a disclaimer, like Oliver Dowden does, the Culture Secretary, to say this is based on true events or inspired by true events, rather than nothing at all, which maybe people believe it might be true?
Perhaps I do think that, because the makers of The Crown definitely try to have it both ways. So they say, there's an implication that this is what it's really like. And then if you say, well, actually, it wasn't really like that because X and Y and Z, I mean, the factual errors are very frequent, let alone the interpretations. They say, oh, yes, but this is only a drama. So they're trying to really have their cake and eat it. In one way, I sympathise with Peter Morgan. You can't have everything accurate. You have to sort of get at the heart of it rather than, for example, there's a completely made-up scene which I think is very good in The Crown, which is when Diana first meets Charles. She was not dressed as Puck, and she wasn't dancing around artificial bushes inside Althorp House. But it's a brilliant scene. It's the sort of playfulness of the young, flirtatious teenager and the older man being charmed and a bit surprised and amused. I think that's legitimate. But when you get serious errors of what actually happened, particularly if they reflect badly on the person concerned, some of the stuff about Prince Charles, some of the stuff about Prince Charles and Mountbatten, some of the behaviour of the Duke of Edinburgh and things, people do believe it. Because it's an exciting drama and it's well presented, they sort of think it must be true, and it isn't.
But they're relying on a lack of response from the palace, aren't they? They can get away with it because there'll be no complaint or no suing or no legal action.
I think that is right. And I don't think the palace, unless there's some very exceptional reason, would be well advised to intervene in any way. I think that's just the way it is, yeah.
It's damaging though, isn't it? I mean, do you feel the monarchy has been damaged, or Prince Charles personally? Or?
Well, funnily enough, fundamentally no, because of the way these things work as great myths. I've done a lot of broadcasting and talking to Americans about this who are loving The Crown and fascinated by it. And I say to them at the end of it all, because they say, oh, wasn't it awful when Camilla something, or Charles, etc. But then I say, well, what do you think at the end of it all about the Queen and the monarchy? And they say, we think she's great. We think it's great. So dignified and amazing. And what a story. And so in some funny way, at the meta level, despite all these bad things, this is sort of great big good thing that comes out. And it somehow made the monarchy and the Crown even more, I mean, I don't mean the programme, The Crown, even more important in the history of modern world.
There's no such thing as bad publicity, is what you're saying.
Well, in a funny way, certainly at that sort of mythic level, yes.
Have you grown to love Olivia Colman's left-wing face?
I've always said on this that Olivia Colman's a superb actress, but I think she is miscast. One of the things about the Queen, which goes with the role and the personality, is that she is very well trained in hiding any feelings she might have and wearing a sort of mask of regality. And I think Claire Foy, as the young Queen, did that brilliantly. And I'm afraid I don't think Olivia Colman does do that, because she's sort of more, her emotions are more showing, and that's not how it is.
I should say to listeners who don't read all of Charles's columns like I do, that he did famously describe Olivia Colman as having a left-wing face, which meant that her face looked as though it might be political in some way, when, of course, the Queen's regal visage never betrays that. I should say my 15-year-old daughter thinks Keeley Hawes would have been a much better Queen. If you look at Keeley Hawes on Google Images, you'll see what I mean. Just very, very quickly, on Brexit, Charles Moore, you've been a champion of Brexit from the very beginning. We're nearly there with Brexit happening. What would Margaret Thatcher have made of this Brexit we might be getting?
I always try to avoid the what would she question because I don't know the answer. But what I do know is that she did want it. She didn't know the word Brexit because she died in 2013. But she had been, since shortly after leaving office in 1990, she had been in favour of us leaving the European Union, but never said so publicly.
Correcting her mistake of the ever closer union.
I think so, yes. And she never said so in public because she was advised that it would cause so much controversy, it was bad for the party and so on. But she said to many people, including to me, that she did think we should leave. And she did also publicly say that there should be a referendum. So those two things coming together, that is the direction in which she had moved.
Well, nearly there. Is the Brexit we're getting the one that you think we should be having?
I mean, it's been unbelievably fraught. And of course, we don't know the detail. But there's a logic in it. We voted for it. Parliament tried to stop it. They failed, and Boris won the election strongly on that basis. He got the key part of Brexit. And now the second bit, also very important, comes along. I don't think it's going to be at all easy, and I don't think it's going to be 100% victory, but I think it will follow the logic and will fundamentally succeed.
Charles Moore, Telegraph columnist, thank you so much for joining us on Chopper's podcast. I should say also that the third volume of your magisterial biography of Margaret Thatcher is now in paperback and available to buy in all good bookshops and probably Amazon.
Thank you, Chris. Thanks very much.
Thank you to my guests this week, David Campbell-Bannerman, Raoul Ruparel, and of course Charles Moore there. Thank you to my producers, Louisa Wells, Theo Luludis and Elliot Lampitt. And of course, thank you to you for listening. We'll be back again next week for a Christmas special with our best bits from a year which has been like no other. And maybe a few behind-the-scenes bloopers too. You won't want to miss it. And if you're wondering what to get me for Christmas, I would love a 5-star rating, please. And a review on Apple Podcasts. It really helps other people find this show and tune in. And of course, our gift to you for listening is 30 days free access to the Telegraph's best content by going to telegraph.co.uk/chopper. And after that, you pay just £2 a week. And of course, please buy a copy of the Daily Telegraph if you can, from all good newsagents. Until next time, cheerio!